Good evening, everyone. Spotlight. Welcome to Brighton Grammar. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the headmaster, Ross Featherston. Many of you know me because your parents are connected to the school, but I do know we have some external guests and interested parties here as well. So welcome to the school. As we do on occasions like this, we acknowledge that we meet together on the Boonwurrung people's lands of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians on the land on which Brighton Grammar is built and where we are today. I would like to pay respect to the elders both past and present of the Kulin Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who are present and represented among us. We also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. So welcome to this evening. I'm not going to talk. You need me to get out of the way so you hear from the experts, the people that you're here to see. A couple of points though before I introduce Dr Ray Swann. These position papers that we had out have sold out. They were $20. Yeah, you get the joke. No, we've run out of them. But if you have registered, we will email you an electronic copy of this position paper tomorrow. So don't worry. FOMO is alive and well at Brighton. If you feel that you missed out, don't worry, you'll get one of these tomorrow. Tonight's a really exciting night for us as a school. We've been working on all things positive masculinity, as you would know, hopefully for a number of years now. It's taken us a long time to get Matt here. COVID got in the way for a little while. But a lot of the credit, if not all of the credit in terms of the work we're doing on positive masculinity needs to go to the gentleman to my left down the front here, Dr Ray Swann, who many of you would know if you've been at the school for even just this year or longer. You would know Ray and the work that he does through our Crowther Centre and his fantastic team. So I just wanted to publicly pay tribute to the work that Ray's done. He's very passionate about it from a personal perspective, but he's equally as passionate about it from a professional perspective. And tonight, in some ways, as a Collingwood supporter, it's a little bit of his grand final on the eve of the AFL season, but it's with great pleasure that I introduce, to kick off this evening, formally Dr Ray Swann. Thanks again.
Thanks for those kind words, Ross, and good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Matt Englar-Carlson, who comes all the way from the Centre for Men and Boys at California State University, Fullerton. Matt completed his undergraduate studies at the University of California and then went on to do 2 master's degrees at Stanford, which I'm slightly envious of. He completed his doctorate studies at Penn State. Matt's an all-rounder. Much of his work is focused on men and boys, but he's worked as a school counsellor, he's worked one-on-one in psychology with mothers, daughters, he's done group counselling and professional sport. Matt's an athlete, he's a dad, a music lover, surfer and friend to many. I'm actually taking him to the footy on Friday night, so hopefully we'll add Magpie fan to that list as well. At the Crowther Centre, we became really interested in Matt's strength-based approach to raising boys and wellbeing. A cold call email and a bit of luck a few years ago saw us connect. He's in Series 2 of the Understanding Boys podcast and was a keynote at the Plus M webinar we ran in 2021. They had an audience of over 1,500 people. Masculinity can seem like a contested space sometimes, but I think what unites all of us in the room are 2 things. Firstly, we're striving to raise the healthy men we need for this age. Raising healthy boys benefits all genders, men who are kind, compassionate and comfortable with who they are. Men who don't have to prove their manhood all the time, who are flexible when approaching life's challenges. Sometimes we need backbone, sometimes we need heart. Men who are upstanders, not bystanders. And secondly, we're united by a shared concern for the world right now, and for boys in particular. You see, on one hand, as we strive for a more inclusive future, we acknowledge that being male has advantages. But men and boys are also more likely to drop out of school, are more likely to go to jail, a factor of 7 to 1, are more likely to die by suicide. And sadly, as boys become men and then elders, these challenges don't go away. Often they worsen. But there is hope. Positive masculinities help us to get upstream of many of these challenges. The framework, the thinking and the programs support ways for boys to learn actually how to connect to themselves, to their feelings, to be comfortable in their own skin, and to see the vital contribution that they can make to the shaping of the world to come. And so it is with great pleasure I welcome Professor Matt Englar-Carlson to address us this evening.
Let's see. One second here.
Do you want me to pick up?
Oh, the clicker. Okay.
I have to turn this on for you. All yours.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to lower this just a bit and take off my glasses again so I can look out and see everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. It means a great deal to me, but it means a great deal to the school, and I think it also just speaks to the fact that you have boys who you care about, and you want them to be healthy and happy, and you want them to grow to be the men they want to be. And it's really exciting to be here. Sometimes I've told the story a few times the past couple of days about how I found out about Brighton Grammar, but a little louder, is that better? Okay, thank you. About 10 years ago or so, I probably put positive masculinity into Google, just checking now and then to see if I got any hits, if those papers I wrote meant anything to anybody. And I found this link for this school in Australia, and so I clicked on the link thinking we'll see what's there, and it was kind of like the Matrix. Like my mind was just kind of blown, because what I saw was, here is this place that was putting research and evidence-based science into practice. And I immediately thought, who are these people talking to? Who are they consulting with? Who is kind of helping them kind of create a school like this that, for me, I thought, well, this is where I would like to send my son, right? And so over the past 6-7 years, I've sent many colleagues and friends to the website here, and so this is what it's supposed to look like, and so it's a real honor to actually be here today and to speak with you. Thank you, Ray, for the introduction, and for Ross as well. Actually, I think I don't need these. That's going to be a little bit easier for me. I do want to share a bit about kind of who I am as well, so you kind of know my location in terms of how I came to this kind of field. But I am a professor at Cal State Fullerton, which is in Southern California. I've been there for 20 years. I've been focused on the psychology of men and masculinities for close to 25. Prior to being an academic, I was a school counselor in the Bay Area near San Francisco. And upper right, or your left, that's my father, John Carlson. He was a big influence in my life. My dad was a psychologist. I was pretty much on his knee most of the time. To every conference he went to, I was kind of there, usually sitting in the back. So I had a really good relationship with my dad, and so I came to this very honestly, I think, which is having a very loving relationship with my father. And then, and even having a very loving relationship with my father, I also realized that there were things that we didn't talk about. Like, we did a lot of things together, but we didn't talk about some things, which was kind of strange, because people who knew my dad thought, oh, he must be very emotive. And I was like, well, he was Swedish and kind of stoic, and we did a lot of things, and we knew a lot of things, but we just didn't talk about it all that much. And later in his life, we actually did have some deeper conversations, but it took a lot of work. And I have 2 children. I have a son, Jackson, who's 18. I have a daughter, B, who's 14. They're, what I care about most in the world, pretty much. And I really thought, how can I have this relationship with my son and daughter the way I had with my mom and dad, right? And also make it better, right? And again, I'm going to probably talk about this a little bit tonight, but when we do talk about things like gender, when we talk about raising boys, there is this recognition for sure that I know that the culture and the world that my dad grew up in, right, as, is not the world that I grew up in, right? And it's not the world that my son is actually growing up in right now. It's different because gender is fluid and it's changing all the time. And so norms about what it means to be a man or a woman are also changing around that too. Some of the work I've done is I focus on kind of guidelines for professional practice for working with boys and men. That's through the American Psychological Association. I have a Center for Boys and Men, and then recently I've helped launch the first mental health app for men called Mental. And so it's, like to say, it's created by men for men, and so if you want to check it out, there's a link there, getmental.com. So I'm not trying to sell it, I'm just saying it's pretty interesting and unique. And so I think it's promise of what is to come, right? And it comes from a very good place. So. I was a school counselor in the early 1990s in the Bay Area in San Francisco. And one of the things that I did as a school counselor at that time was there was this growing awareness at that moment around the complex lives of adolescent girls. And this awareness that girls had lives that led to concerns around body image. We were more aware around self-harm, more aware around anxiety and depression. And I remember a teacher coming up to me and showing me a book called Reviving Ophelia, which maybe some of you have read, and she said, I just read this book, what are you going to do about it? And I said, well, I'll read the book. So I read the book, and I thought, you're right, like there's this whole world that girls are going through, and we should do something about it. I came to that teacher, and I said, let's form a group. So we created a mother-daughter group, and the premise essentially was at that time was, what if we could preload these girls with all the things that they might need to know so that when they're 18, 19, 20, 21, they're not going to come back and say, I wish I would have known that sooner. It was a huge success. The way the group worked, girls had to come with their moms. We met for a year and a half. Almost every girl in junior high was a part of that program. Right after the success of that group, people come to me and say, well, you should do this for father and sons. And at the time, I was a little bit flippant, but I said, I don't think they'll come. And the reality is that I actually didn't think they would come. Working in a school, I realized I had very little contact with fathers. I had lots of contact with boys. Most of that contact was connected to the headmaster who would bring boys into my office. So I knew the boys really, really well. I just didn't see their fathers all that much. And the reality is that I actually wasn't very prepared to work with fathers and sons in that way in boys. My early training had been in actually gender studies and women's studies. In some ways, I felt like I knew more about that than I did about myself as a man. When I went and did my PhD, I decided I wanted that to change. I immediately became interested in the psychology of men and masculinities. And I realized that, by the time I finished my PhD, I should be able to run the group that I couldn't run 4 years prior. And in many ways, that's kind of what I want to talk to you tonight, which is almost a redo of that exact same group, which is if we understand the concerns that men have right now, and we understand kind of where the difficulties are that adult men have right now, couldn't we actually talk to boys right now and prepackage, do primary prevention, and help them understand where those risks are, right? And so that's kind of where I want to go. To do so, what I want to make sure we do is we really center on what it means to be male today. So I'm going to ask you to kind of really think about what it means to be a boy today. And to think about what your sons, and I realize there's lots of parents here, I think there's coaches, I think there's mentors, but most people here in some capacity or another have a boy in their life that they care a great deal about. And so we're really going to center on what their experiences are like right now. Okay. I think one of the things, though, that makes that a little bit hard, because what I've come to believe and what I actually still believe today is that when it comes to boys and men, and I think boys and men experience this too, is that we see what's happening in the world, Like we see what's happening around things like educational attainment, we see things happening around unemployment, we see things around suicide, mental health, but we don't know what to do about it. And that's one of the aspects of masculinity is that if we believe that men are supposed to be independent and strong, do things by themselves, it makes it hard for us to offer help, right? And so, there's a duality of privilege around that, right? That male privilege often allows you to kind of have strength, right? And to be things like independent and strong. And yet the duality is that actually is what kills most men. Is this inability to actually to ask for help and get help when you actually need it. And so I think that, again, I think we see what's happening in boys and men in our current society. We don't know what to do about it. Again, that's not because we don't have personal understanding, but it's the power of male norms around us, right? That kind of encourage us to be silent, to not talk about it. Okay? And social norms dictate behavior, essentially, right? And social norms are everywhere. Okay. So I've asked you a moment to kind of really centralize and think about what it means to be a boy today. And I'm going to ask you to do something else, is to think about, what do you want for your son? What do you want for him? Again, this can be your son or a boy in your life that you coach or you mentor or anything like that, but what do you want him to be as he gets older? Okay. Now, you probably had some immediate thoughts, and maybe you revised them 10 seconds later. And I think it's easy to think about things like careers or opportunities or things that we consider success, right? But I've asked this question to a lot of parents over the years, and it's not meant to be a trick question, but most parents, what they really want is their sons to be happy. They want their sons to be healthy, to live a long life and a long, happy life. That's really what we want. And of course, the complexity of parenthood, and as a parent in this modern age, I know it's hard. I know it's hard. It's hard to kind of know how to get there. There's so much information all the time around us. And parents, I feel as a parent, I'm constantly behind it. I'm trying to figure out what I'm supposed to be doing next, and what should I be feeding my child, and what sports should he be doing, and what websites are good, and what websites are bad. And it's hard to kind of sometimes focus on that day to day and realize, how can I actually chart a path so that my son can be happy and healthy? If we do center our thinking around happy and healthy manhood, one of the things that's useful for us to do, like I said, is think about those concerns, those significant concerns or potholes, right, that he's going to encourage in his life, so that we can kind of figure out as parents, how can we front load this a little bit? How can we actually kind of parent in a purposeful manner so that we can teach kind of the skills and the mental toughness, the flexibility to adapt to life? How can we teach our sons to do hard things? So I think we have to do hard things in life. How teach our sons to fail? Because you got to try a lot of things, right? And when I look at these challenges, primarily where I see these challenges are kind of three areas, which is in health behaviors, that's one, career adaptability, that's two, and social relationships. So I'm going to focus on those three things. There's more, for sure, but those are the three things I'm going to focus on tonight. My plan is to dance around these three topics, but I will tell you that the through line is the third one. There's actually social relationships. They are, and if you take nothing else away tonight, I would take away the primacy of building relationships in your son's life and helping him build the social skills and having the social fitness to understand how to have healthy relationships with other people. And we'll talk about why that is so important. When we talk about these concerns, I will primarily focus on positive and healthy masculinity, which for most people is a new idea. I don't think it's as new to this audience, which is pretty amazing. But I think we have to have conversations on what is healthy, and we have to have conversations on what is pro-social and what is positive masculinity, rather than only seeing problematic things and discussing toxic kind of things. because we need to know what we're actually striving for. Like, we have to understand what we're trying to parent towards. Are you parenting towards joy, health, grit, mental toughness, towards taking on challenges, pro-social values of kind of community and connection, acceptance, and humility? You have to know where you want to go. If you don't know where you're trying to go as parents, then first of all, you'll never know when you're off course. Or when you know you're off course, you're going to know because you're way off course and you're in crisis. But you also won't know when you've gotten there. So you have to kind of know what you're shooting for. So my question is, like, where are you aiming your compass? Right? Okay. Oh, I did it right there. Okay, I missed that one. So why is this in particularly important now, right? Why are we having this conversation right now? And the main reason is because adolescence is a critical period for boys. And their parents, too, as someone who has sent off an adolescent and also has one in the house as well. It's a critical period. Every day feels very critical sometimes, I realize. But I think the thing around it, why it's so critical, is that the data suggests that adolescence is when boys begin to shift into adult patterns of health behaviors, particularly heightened health risk behaviors, particularly the ages of actually 15 and 17, right? So to translate that, what your boys are doing at 15 and 17 is kind of a template for what they're going to do, particularly with health risk behaviors in their life, right? So you want to be having conversations around this well before they get to 15 and 17. So healthy choices now are healthy choices later, right? And I think that's an important thing that we need to know. Another reason why this is important, because it just reinforces this notion of kind of being a purposeful parent at this time. There's a difference between being passive and actually purposeful. So I think the reason why I think this is important is because we have to realize how strong social norms really are. Social norms is everything that's around here that's telling your boys in terms of how they're supposed to be, okay? In the absence of correction from influential adults, i.e. parents and teachers and coaches probably, there's a strong likelihood that those norms are going to shape their behavior. I work partially for a tech company right now, working on this app. I've learned a lot more about tech and about like some really wonderful things. And I've learned some really horrible things too, about like why most of us, but particularly adolescents, can't get the phone out of their hands, right? And how it's a stacked deck, essentially. The algorithms are working against them, right? You know, and again, I think that's kind of, I would say the parallel is that actually with social norms, is that the social norms are out there, and they are going to curb behavior for your child, right? Unless you have a corrective in some capacity. You have to have a competing narrative. You have to have a processing component in which you kind of are curious about what he's experiencing. I had a really wonderful experience yesterday going into a classroom, 6th grade, and there's a Q&A for about 45 minutes. I think it was supposed to be 5 minutes, but it went 45 minutes long. It was really wonderful. And I got to hear, like, you know, the first 5 minutes were very professional and very like, you know, oh, you're from California. Have you been to Disneyland? Do you like the Lakers? You know, all these like things are very, but then it got serious really quick. We moved beyond who's my favorite chef and do I fold my pizza to why are there so many guns in America? Oh, why are there so many school shootings? Do teachers carry guns? What do I think of Andrew Tate? What color is my Bugatti going to be? You know, and I realized, like, as they began to get loosened, I began to see their feed. What is the feed? What are they thinking about? I've never watched an Andrew Tate video, I can say. I seem to know a lot about him right now, though, because every source out there is telling me that I should know about him. That if I care about boys and I care about young men, I should know what his influence is right now. And I think that, again, that is coming across his feed. That is part of the social norms that are happening around him. And, you know, I don't police my daughter's phone. and I don't police my son's phone, right? But we do have conversations about like, what are you looking at and what's so interesting about that? And I often play the kind of like, I don't know what's really going on, so educate me about this thing. But I need to know what essentially is coming across her feed around that, and I know that both my kids will actually talk to me about it at this point. But I put that out there because I think like that social feed and what's happening, that is the social norms. And like I said earlier, that's not what I was getting when I was 17. Most of the social norms I was getting was delivered through 3 channels on television, movies we would rent at the video store, and probably like a newspaper, right? That's where I was getting my social feed at that point, and then talking about it with friends. And there's never been a point in humanity in which information is available so quick, in which the dopamine hit is so fast with your phone, right? And so I don't want this to be like to go into like the horrors of social media, but it's just a way of saying like for young men and for boys, like what they're seeing, is going to influence how they view kind of their own dreams and how they behave and the relationships that they actually create. Kind of why I think, again, I got off my, here's a second, okay, so why now? The other reason why I think this is like really, really critical, right here. Well, that's when you don't put page numbers on your notes, and that's what happens. So I think the other thing around adolescence, why it's really critical is that, again, for many parents, this is this moment in which you're thinking about launching your child. Like there's a likelihood that that adolescent will become a young adult and will eventually go away. And at some point you still have a lot of influence though. Even though you may not think it sometimes, caring adults are critical for adolescents. And again, like I just really encourage you to think about that compass, where you want to go. What is that counter narrative that is important to you and your family? And how do you talk about it consistently with your kids? Okay. I mentioned health behaviors. And so health behaviors, in terms of kind of, even when I talk to larger audiences, I usually start with this because I think when we look at, and honestly, the health behaviors in Australia aren't that different than the United States, outside of the fact that your longevity is like 5 years longer, which is a very good reason to move to Australia. I know, I told my partner last night, maybe we should move to Australia, soon, so we can take advantage of that 5-year boost. But this is true, is that despite having greater SES advantages, we know that men are at greater risk of serious chronic disease, injury, and death, and they die in Australia 4 years earlier than women. In the States, it's 5, right? And that mortality rate in itself, should be raising alarms. Why is it that men die 4 years sooner? Because we know, for the most part, it's not related to biology. And so I find that very alarming, right? I think we know that men die in greater numbers than women in almost every single non-sex-specific health category, right? And that highest disparity is in suicide, right? And I am someone who's very concerned about male suicide. I'm surprised that we don't consider it a crisis, honestly. And I think what scares me the most is that I think for particularly men, suicide is a normative behavior in some ways to consider, right? And I think we have to just have real conversations with our sons about not harming ourselves, right? And take it very, very seriously. But this notion in terms of kind of health and kind of where we are and why health behaviors matter is, like I said earlier, we know that why we have these disparities, it's all signs point to masculinity, actually. Not being male, but culturally shaped norms about what it means to be a man. So what do I mean by that? There are kind of 6 aspects of kind of male health behaviors that stand out. And I'm going to kind of go through them, and I'm going to begin by saying, I'm going to give you this long list. At the end of the list, you're going to think, does Matt even like men? Because he's saying all these things that sound really not so great. But I'm just going to let you know, because maybe you didn't know these things. But when it comes to things like health-promoting behaviors, we know that men are less healthy, They engage in far fewer health promotion behaviors. They're more overweight, eat more meat, fat, and salt, less fiber, fruit, and veggies, less likely to do self-examinations, higher cholesterol, blood pressure, do less to reduce, less likely to wear sunscreen, seat belts, and bike helmets. They sleep less well, they're less likely to take time off for illness. Sound like anybody you know? It makes sense, right? And again, I get this information from insurance companies. When they look at why someone pays certain rates for certain things in the States, that's where most of the information comes from, but it mirrors information here. When it comes to risk-taking behavior, we know that men are more likely to use, abuse alcohol, tobacco, and drugs, drive drunk, have more sexual partners, carry weapons, twice as likely to die of a drug overdose, responsible for most automobile accidents, and largely responsible for transmission of STDs. When it comes to physical abuse and violence, more likely to commit acts of physical abuse and violence, more likely to be victims of physical abuse and violence, more likely to be injured in a physical fight, and more likely to die from murder and suicide. When I teach my students, and overwhelmingly I teach female students, but I ask women, how many of you have been in a physical fight? A couple hands come up. A couple. I ask men, how many of you have ever been in a physical fight? Every hand almost always goes up. And they'll say, oh, I was 5 or I was 6. But it's normative, right? It's normative for men to fight in many ways. When it comes to social support, we know that men have smaller social networks and fewer friendships, particularly as they get older. They're less likely to have a close confidant, particularly someone other than their spouse or partner. In times of stress, they mobilize less varied social support. With behavioral responses to stress, they have greater use of avoidance strategies, denial, like distractions and alcohol addiction, more overall risk-taking behaviors, and they tend to deny physical or emotional pain, but yet are more severely affected by stress. And the last one is in healthcare use, and we know this very clearly, that men use fewer healthcare services. They're not as likely to have a source of healthcare or a GP, 70% less likely to seek medical help compared to women, twice as likely not to make preventative healthcare visits. Okay. None of that is biology. It's health behaviors, right? And when I look at that, again, I told you it was a long list. But when you look at that, you think those are all places where you can intervene. You can have conversations. So here, the takeaway here is like, again, as parents, what do you do about that? And I think the takeaway here is you begin to think about the implicit and explicit way that health is talked about in your family. The explicit is talking about it. The implicit is the modeling, is the actual modeling of kind of healthcare behaviors and talking about, putting on sunscreen and why that's smart. My son doesn't want to wear sunscreen, ever. And even when he gets burned, which he always does, the logic to me just defies logic. But every time I still have the conversation with him. But I've also realized that I've got different aspects of skin cancers right now that I've had surgeries for, and I've made sure he knows where those came from. It came from growing up a very white child in Hawaii in the 70s and not having sunscreen. So I talked to him about that and give him some type of evidence, that's why that's important, right? But I think it's also talking about when you go see the doctor, helping your sons have some type of health care literacy, health education literacy, to understand what that kind of means. And again, it is nearly impossible for an adolescent and a boy, right, to do things because they want to be alive when they're 70. They don't even know what that means, right? But there's something about just kind of creating these health behaviors. And again, if we know the window, again, your window is 15 to 17, right? You want to be able to kind of talk about this in a way that makes some type of sense. What is really interesting about health behaviors, too, it is related to social norms, which is health behaviors are associated with the way health is viewed or discussed in one's social reference group, okay? Everyone has a social reference group. They're the groups you aspire to be in. They're your friends. There might be colleagues or things like that. We know that the way that a man perceives what is normal health behavior influences his own behavior. That is not true for women. That's what the data suggests. So again, if you're in a social group in which going to see a therapist is okay, you're more likely to go see a therapist because you want to conform to social norms. If you're in a group in which you are not going to talk about your emotions, binge drinking is the norm, right, and risky behavior is all people do, you are going to binge drink and do risky behavior because you want to fit into the social norms around you. Okay? I think this stuff is really, really critical, right? Because again, where it becomes interesting is you cannot pick your son's friends. As much as you try. Like, you know, you can tell him not to see somebody, which we all know that means the likelihood of him seeing them is probably doubled now. So you have to have a counter narrative. And you have to begin to understand that maybe the social norm is larger than him and have a conversation around that. I found that in talking with kids in middle school and talking about this with kids in high school, they do understand this, actually. Okay. Moving to changing world of work, and I'm also going to kind of look at education around this. I'm going to keep this a little brief because I want to talk to the big thing, and I'm trying to be mindful of time, too. We know that the world of work in higher ed is changing. It really is. Right now, career kind of counselors and career educators think that a child today will have 4 to 6 careers over their lifespan. Okay, 4 to 6 different careers over their lifespan. Okay, so being able to change and pivot and adapt is a life skill. Okay. We know that men have struggled with this. Economic recessions over the past 2 decades have shown us that men have struggled with this. Unemployment rates, particularly middle-aged men, are often not because there aren't jobs available, yet times the jobs that are available are ones that men don't want, right? The valued skill right now from employers is actually what we call flexibility or vocational adaptability, and getting along with others in teams. Those are the 2 big skills right now, right? Why I think this is important is that when we think about higher ed, we know that men are not entering higher ed at the same rate that they used to. We know they're not completing at the same rate that they used to, okay? And I do think that's alarming. But I also think we also should have conversations with our sons about this. I know that many 18-year-olds are not ready for college. I teach them. And the worst thing as a college educator is having someone who doesn't want to be in your class, who's in the wrong major. The best student is that student who found what they wanted to do and is now in your class. Because they enter that course of study with vigor that is unlike anything else, right? And I work with a lot of actually returning adult students who at age 40 are doing finally what they want to do. I work with a lot of executives who don't want to do that anymore. They want to be a therapist, right? And they finally found what they wanted to do in their life, right? And I think this is recognition that as much as we should be concerned about the impact of kind of a society in which there's such a disparity around educational attainment, we also want to be able to talk about educational opportunities and alternatives. Vocational school, vocations, and training is a great alternative for a career and a life, and it's also a place to figure out what you want to do, right? And I think having that conversation for a lot of boys is really helpful because it reduces shame around knowing what your parents want you to do and not doing it, right? And what I would say around that is that in higher ed, these are things that we know. Like in higher ed, we know rates around that for every 2 men earning a degree, 3 women will be earning a degree. We know that boys and men tend to start out behind academically and may feel intimidated by schoolwork. They have a harder time committing to school, which has a lot to do with what we call academic self-confidence. They report feeling more isolated in higher ed, and they struggle seeking out fellow student study groups, student affairs, counselors, and things like that when they're in higher ed. And higher ed knows this because this is where they're doing their programming. Higher ed universities and colleges have men's success initiatives. They have different ways to keep men in school. And this is the stuff that they combat, right? What I would say to you as a parent is, and I trust it's happening here too, you don't have to wait till they're in college to do this. You can begin to kind of talk about these kinds of things, about, again, it goes back to the bottom two, being able to seek help, being able to have a social group that supports you, having some academic self-confidence and believing in yourself that this is what you want to do and you can do it. This notion of feeling of when you start out behind and you're intimidated, of course the likelihood to fail and drop out is quite attractive, right? So again, how do we front load our sons to kind of have conversations about this? And actually, I guess I would say is, and can you kind of hear what your son is saying about what he wants to do and understand that without necessarily kind of saying, but I think you should go to college. Because I mean, I realize my son is ready for college, and it's great, right? But I also told him a couple years ago, if you didn't want to go to college, that was okay too. And let's talk about that. And let's have a conversation about other things you could do in your life that I don't care what you do as long as you're doing something. As long as you're doing something that makes you happy, right? And let's goal plan around that, right? And he said, thanks, Dad, but I'm going to college. I said, okay. But I've had the same conversation with my daughter too, because they come from a family of very high achievers. That's a lot of pressure. I know it's a lot of pressure. So I want to relieve that pressure and actually figure out what do they want to do. Because I also believe that whatever they pick at 18, they're going to 4 or 5 careers. It's what they picked at 18. It's probably not what they're going to do at 30. It's probably not what they're going to do at 35, right? And again, that is not the world that I grew up in. It certainly isn't the world that my dad grew up in, right? And so the changing world, the changing economy does impact how we think about this. Okay, I'm going to move to the most important thing, which I saved to the end. I don't want to rush through it too fast. But at the end of the day, it's all about relationships. Like it really, really is. It's the through line, the first couple things I've talked about as well. We looked at those health behavior data. We talked about this notion around men as they get older, they're lonely. They don't know how to make friends like they used to. We understand that part of that mortality rate has a lot to do with the fact that men don't have friends and connections around it. This is not a big secret. I think there's been so many books, popular press books, written about kind of men and friendships right now in isolation. But it is really the most important thing. I do relational work with boys and men. That's the kind of training I had in my PhD. That's how I teach in my own direct work. And I do see this crisis manifested in the ways that boys become men. They become isolated. There's a lack of social support. And I know that men want to connect, though, desperately. They desperately want to connect and have mates and have friends. So there's a disconnect kind of what happens. And I think, again, why this is so important is that data indicates that long-term healthiness is strongly associated with having good relationships. The Harvard study of adult development, which is one of the longest kind of studies of longevity, recently found that the strongest predictors of who not just stayed happy, but who were healthy as they went through life, the strongest predictors were the warmth and quality of their relationships with other people. And I found it was very strange on that press release is that they had 3 old men, probably an 80 plus, on a bench sitting together. And I thought, that's pretty rare, because I've been in assisted living with my mom, and there aren't a lot of men there, right? And the reality is that's one reason why we know that mortality kind of rate is there, is because men don't have connections around that. So how do we as important adults, as parents, teachers, mentors, coaches, help our sons build healthy relationships? Well, here's a couple things I want to mention. One is learning how we call cultivate social fitness. Okay, so, and I guess I go to the first question, like, who do you think is teaching your son about healthy relationships? And it's not social media, right? Like, they're learning a lot about relationships. They just don't have healthy necessarily in it, and teaching your son about healthy relationships and reciprocal relationships is very key, right? And so one thing is kind of how you cultivate what I call social fitness, which is really tending to relationships like we take care of our physical health, right? Just like we take care of our physical fitness. And so what that means is, what are these healthy fitness kind of connection patterns you create? So as a parent, what do you expect from your son? What I mean by that is, like, do you expect calls? Do you expect him to call you when he goes out at night? Do you expect him to text you? I had this conversation with my son when he went to college, and I said, I expect every Sunday to have a phone call with you. And my son said, well, why do you expect me to do that? And I said, because that's what my dad told me when I went to college, because he said that's what his mom told him, And he said, well, can I just text you? And I said, no. You have to call me every Sunday night. And if you're not going to call me, you can tell me why. But I expect to hear from you at least once a week. Like, come on, like it's been 18 years. I've put a lot in. I deserve more than just like a text, And he said, okay. And sure enough, he's done it, right? But like I made it very, very clear. I expect calls. When we're together, this is how I expect you to behave. I expect you to put away the phone. When we have dinner together, no phones. No phones, right? And when we're together, like, it's not just special time. When we're together, right? I expected that I taught him about thank you cards. And trust me, I know the trauma as a parent of actually getting your kids to send thank you cards. But kind of saying, like, why would you do that? Like, and what is the expectation that you're going to have around that, right? But I made this very explicit with him, right? And then I actually modeled it. So I don't have my phone at dinner either, right? It isn't rules for adults and rules for kids. They're just family rules, and we all follow them. So again, like, being really clear about that. Two is that realizing that, that some boys are socialized in behaviors and attitudes that do foster disconnection. The norms around toughness and being stoic have a lot to do around control, right? And how boys can learn to control their world. They do learn to cut off from their feelings. There's a lot of kind of evidence around how that happens around them. And often in that process of being cut off from their feelings, they undermine their ability to understand the feelings of others. That's the biggest fear, right? Is they don't necessarily develop emotional recognition or empathy, or actually this ability to actually regulate their emotions. So that is something that's happening around them and may not be happening here at the school, right? But it does happen in the larger kind of world. And so when we see that as adults, and we see our sons kind of maybe showing toughness and not being connected with their emotions, it's quite common that adults intervene with concern, or at times irritation, or with a heavy hand, but often without validation instead. Like we jump in to kind of solve it, right? And the reality is I think we need to do something different. We have to change that, which is actively listen, validate, hold space for your son in those moments without needing to fix it or explain it away. And main thing, without controlling it. So in these key kind of moments, like when you're with your son and you know something is going on, and you kind of say, what's going on? And I don't want to talk about it, or like, I can't talk about it, or it's nothing, or first of all, when they're giving you that nonverbal behavior that clearly says, I don't want to talk about it, maybe don't talk about it then. Like say, okay, maybe later. Because the cool thing about adolescents is they can flip a switch. They can be like so distant and upset with you in one moment, and the next moment act like that never happened. And with my daughter, it usually is like a heartfelt apology, which I think I love that. But my son, I never got the apology. But what I got is kind of a moment of like, that has passed. The cloud has passed. Now I'm ready to engage, and I'm almost ready to talk to you about that eventually. And I learned that if I didn't push it, again, when I push it, I'm controlling. I'm trying to control that setting, right? And he's feeling out of control in that moment. So in that moment, what he does is all he can do, which is this. I'm going to control what I can, which is to block you out, right? So in those moments, I would say, like, when he is ready to talk, two things: curiosity, take an interest in what they're saying and ask questions, and empathy. Feel the feelings, what he's going through. So create space to kind of feel what he feels and validate it back. Validate it back is a very counseling word. I teach counselors, right? But validation is essentially to mirror the emotion back, to shine a light on the other person you're with. This is what I have learned. A mentor taught me this, and I really like it. So the exercise I use myself at home when I imagine my teenager is trying to tell me something, my son's trying to tell me something, is I imagine that my teenager is a reporter. My son is a reporter, and I'm his editor. So my son is reading to me his latest article. And my job is to listen intently, and then when he comes to the end of the draft, I can produce a headline, right? The headline being a distilled, accurate summary of what he said that didn't introduce any new ideas, right? And it just shows that I'm listening to him. Because what I will get is a story full of bits and pieces here and there, and I say, you're upset with your coach. I could say, teenage boy, upset with coach, angry, but I said, like, you're upset with your coach. And yes, I am. That's why I usually get back, right? But thinking about that notion of how you validate kind of things back, what I'm also aware in these moments is the role of shame. If you want to understand men, period, males, period, the core emotion is shame. It is. And I, as someone who's worked with a lot of men in their life in clinical sessions and talk, it's shame, right? And I will tell you that men have shamed themselves well before you have done it. They are so sensitive to outside judgment. And boys in particular are really aware of being watched, of being policed. And, so again, when I work with any young man, the main thing I'm thinking is like, I am not going to shame this boy. And my son, he had two parents who were therapists who both study gender stuff. And he is one of the most shame-driven people I've ever met in my life. And I always, for a long period of time, I thought, like, boy, what did we do wrong? Which I think is a very normal parent thing to think. And then I realized, I just need to do something different. And I realized that my son is in the moment, I just have to hold him. It doesn't matter if he's 4 or 14. I learned that. Like, I just got to hold him, and not say anything. And that will help, and eventually he'll come around, right? But it took a lot to get to that point to figure out, I just have to hold him, and that's it. Wish someone would have taught me that. But shame is really, really critical. And so again, when you're talking to your son about sensitive things, any sharing emotions around that, just be really conscious of that. I'd say walk around it with tiptoes, right? Because I think that if you don't shame him, he's willing to kind of share more. It's simple as that. I'm going to finish on a couple kinds of things, then I'm actually done. When it comes to relationships with adults, first of all, they're important. Like, they're really important. You are the counter-narrative, right? I know you don't feel like the voice of reason sometimes, or maybe you actually do know you're the voice of reason, and you may think, like, he doesn't realize I'm the voice of reason, but it's really important, right? And if you notice your relationship with your son or a boy has weakened or broken between the two of you, this sounds a little harsh, but your job is the relationship manager here. It's your job to repair that relationship because you're the adult, frankly. The job falls on the adult, not the boy. You have to maintain that connection because to not maintain and fight for that connection risks disconnection, right? And disconnection in boys is a serious thing, right? Because that's when they begin to isolate, and that's when shame builds even more, and that's when they begin to not to talk to the people around them. And that's what worries me as a clinician, right? So again, realizing that you work really hard and you try to make connection all the time, but it's your job. And I've actually said that to my kids before. When I'm badgering them, I say to them, like, I understand you don't want to talk about this, but I'm an adult and I'm the manager of the relationship. So I'm gonna have to keep talking to you about this, right? Because I'm not going to let you go. Like, I'll let you go right now, but you got to come back. But I'm not going to let this thing, this fissure expand, right? That's one. Two is, like I said, relationship with adults is critical because it validates and reflects who he is. Relationships with adults is where kind of boys and adolescents actually kind of challenge and question kind of what they're hearing around them, right? It's when they begin to kind of at times kind of say, like, I'm seeing these things on social media, and like, what do you think about that? And you are trusted, even though at times you may feel like you're disrespected at times, but they do trust you. And the thing I would say about this is that it's your job to manage proactive conversations with your sons too. And what I mean by that is that a lot of conversations that you're going to have with other adults regarding your son are about things that aren't always going to be good. Like often when they're in trouble or when someone wants to tell you something about something went wrong. And I think before you let that be the only narrative about your child, I think it's also really important to have a counter narrative. So if you know something happened and you're being called in because Ray is going to talk to you about something that your son did, like, start by saying, before we start, let me just tell you a bit about my son and why he's amazing and the things I really, really like about him. Because if not, it's very easy to get a reputation as a troubled boy. And once you get that reputation, it's hard to shake. And it's really hard to shake in systems around that. And so again, I feel like that's you as the relationship manager. You're also kind of their PR. So now you're the manager, and neither you're their PR. But if not, I think people will fall back on stereotypes. And the last thing I would say is, of course, is never underestimate the power of truly listening to boys. Research has made it very, very clear that boys have rich emotional lives. Research of Niobe Way, NYU, has made that very, very, very clear, right? The stereotype is that they don't, because they don't express it in the way that we expect it to be expressed. And a lot of the inner rich life of boys, right, is fueled by disconnection, right? Is moments of kind of being very close to boys and then aspects of kind of masculinity or norms kind of breaking that connection, saying you can't be that close to a boy, mainly because of homophobia, right? You can't be that close and can't do things you want to do because you got to grow up and be tough, right? So never underestimate truly listening to them and validate them to reduce shame and knowing them and standing by them, right, in the rough waters of boyhood hit. Because behind every single boy who avoids being swept away in those waters, in that current, is someone who stands by him, right, and believes in his ability to hold his own in those waters. And that's what we need to do. So I'm going to end there. Thank you very much for listening. And I think we have a panel now in which you can ask questions. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Matt. You've given us a lot to think about. We have got some questions, and we will get a panel assembled in just a moment. But before we do, we've got some gifts for you to thank you. And I feel these are kind of on behalf of all of us, actually. So let me just grab them. So the first gift, normally we'd unwrap these, but I have to show everyone as well. So nothing says positive masculinity like a Brighton Grammar koala bear. That's the first one.
My daughter is very happy now because she asked me to get one of these. So.
Awesome. Nothing says disrupt gender norms like some tea towels. Use them wisely.
Oh, cool. Okay. Oh, and they're dark. Perfect.
And our third little gift for you is, it's been amazing weather. It's not normally like this. Next time you come back, you're going to need this.
Okay.
So let's thank again Matt Englar-Carlson.
Thank you. Excellent.
So I'll just invite the other panellists just to come up and join us. We've got about 10 minutes or so, and we'll invite some questions from the audience. So those that are joining us on the panel, if you want to come and jump up and join Matt. We have, I think, coming up on stage, so Ali Wigg, who is a key writer of the Positive Masculinity curriculum. And, thank you, Kristen Malloy, many of you would know, Associate Head of Crowther and works in parent programs and literacy. And Michael Wilson. So Michael is from Origin. He's someone who was on our design team probably for about 5+ years of working on how we're going to, implement this work across the school. He's actually probably one of the great rising stars in this space, in the research field. So really glad that Michael can join us as well from Origin. So I think we've got some people around the place with microphones, and we might get one upstairs as well. So just while people are collecting their thoughts for some questions which we'll take, I might even just get one started. Over to you, Ali. One of the things that we've had across the time in my journey with Matt in the last few days is about teaching boys positive masculinities. What does that look like? How do they find it? What happens in the classroom here at school? Ali.
Thanks, Ray. This is our third year of having an explicit positive masculinity curriculum at BGS, and it's been 4 or 5 years in the making. Very deliberate choices were made around making it a comfortable and safe space. There was discussions around, do we get someone to come in, talk to the year level once, and that's our positive masculinity for the year. And we very quickly decided that that wasn't an okay aspect for us. We wanted it to be more meaningful, but we also wanted it to be taught by teachers and people that the boys knew, and that they weren't just hearing it from, but they were seeing it from throughout the year in the classroom, but also out in the yard at recess and lunch and at sport and at any other subject that they were in. So from then, we came up with a design of around 10 or so lessons across the year, and they had specific focuses around 3 main aspects. And the first main aspect was around being authentic, so understanding who they are as a person, what they stand for, who influences their identity and what they decide is their beliefs, and how they can navigate that as they change throughout life. We've all had identity crisis every now and then, I think. The second component is around connection, and that's exactly the main focus, I think, of tonight's talk from Matt, is around positive social connections with a variety of people in their lives. And as they've gone from year 7 through to year 10, experiencing the curriculum, the complexity of that changes. And so what does that look like once they do leave BGS and enter the big wide world? The third one is around motivation. We know that having a passion, understanding what your passions are, what your purpose is really important for driving behaviour and having those positive behaviours. So throughout 7 to 10, those 3 aspects are touched on, age and stage appropriate, but giving our students the toolkit that once they leave BGS, they are better enabled to deal with the challenges that life throws them.
Thanks, Ali. Is there a question from the audience? Yeah.
I can do it without my phone.
Professional.
Yeah. I have the question. I was just wondering, to Matt, in your time and in all your studies and your experience, have you ever come up with sort of like a mindset or something to tell people when they're being that, relationship like coach or managing, how their son experiences relationships or experiences the world, but that identity and those beliefs are maybe like a total reverse and flip on yours as the coach? It's a big one, I know.
It's a great question. So the question is, when you're in that role of the relationship manager or the coach, and you're working with your son, and you realize that his beliefs are very different from yours. And I'm essentially, you probably mean like value-based too. Like the values are very different. I think that I don't know if I have a mindset that I would say like this is the answer to that, but I do think, I have learned in general that you don't get very far, sometimes telling people what they shouldn't think. And I think that like boys in particular are very sensitive to being told what not to do, right? And so I think what I would do is I'd be very inquisitive, Like, I'd probably ask a lot of reflective questions. Help me understand kind of why that's important to you. Help me understand why you feel that way, and how might that help? Like, I would want to like interrogate softly, kind of understanding why that is important to him around that. And then I think there may be a moment where I might also say, and like, let me help, again, before I impose my values, I want to hear his, right? But I also want to like understand, like, is this for shock? Has he really thought about this very much? Is it, who else around him is telling him this? Like, I wonder if other people around you feel this way too, right? Because I guess I would say, I know it's kind of psychological, but I feel like there's elements around some of what we see is kind of like boys, like shadow side, right? Like there's an aspect around like this part of kind of who they are that they know they're not supposed to express. And, part of adolescence is actually stretching and kind of figuring some of these things out. And, like there are a lot of things that I probably did in adolescence that I wish I could take back. But like I had to make those mistakes or think certain things or say certain things that now I go back and think, I don't believe that anymore, right? So I think that there's something around like how we like whether change opinions. Like I think part of it is like it's exposure to other beliefs. But Michael, you have something to say on that? I was wondering the way you're. Yeah, sure. Yeah. I saw that look in your eye. So, yeah.
A longing look.
Yes.
No, I guess I would just add some of the research I'm working on at the moment is really around the way that masculinity can interact when relationships do break down. Because I suppose I'm interested in suicide prevention for boys and men and really looking at relationship breakdown, divorce, separation, because it is a really big risk factor for suicide in boys and men. So I suppose, in terms of just echoing what Matt was talking about, there are particular times when connection is just the most critical aspect, and we know that masculinity, traditional masculine norms can sometimes be a barrier to that sense of connection, and relationship breakdowns can really be a time when, you obviously lose such a critical source of connection, but a time when social support around you needs to kind of rally as much as possible. So I hope that adds something to your question. I'm not really sure. I've forgotten what the question was, but that's kind of what we're interested in at the moment.
Thank you, Michael. Is there another question from the audience? Yeah, Alex. You've got a loud enough voice, I think, haven't you, Alex?
Sorry.
Alex was once actually on stage here as the lead role in a musical, I seem to recall.
He's about to sing.
That's right. So
Absolutely.
give us a rendition of...
This is just for the panel. So it's been spoken about tonight about social fitness, and it was likened to physical fitness. I'm sure everyone in the room can understand the value of physical fitness and what it allows us to do, especially as we get older and become more mature in life. But I'm curious, how, this is open to the entire panel, how you would communicate the value of social fitness to, a young person.
I can start. I guess I really like the way you put it, likening it to physical fitness, and, often for boys and men, that idea can really resonate, particularly with things like therapy. You might go to the gym to work on your physical fitness, but you go to a psych to work on your mental fitness. So I think putting it in that way and kind of using language like that to communicate it as something that, using language that already resonates can really help.
I liked what Matt said about teaching, putting your phones away, writing thank you notes and so on, because I think that social fitness also enables us to connect. I think if we're not socially fit, if we're not looking people in the eye, if we're on our phones when we're trying to have a conversation, then we are actually alone and we're not connecting in an appropriate way. And I think, even things like writing thank you notes, which I also feel your pain with that in terms of getting people to do that. But I think just in terms of how that then impacts on the other person and how they then feel, much more positively inclined to you, which I think then enables a better relationship. So I think there is value in it because it's often empathy based as well. So you are considering how other people are feeling about how you are acting. That's how I felt. Yes.
Great. Other questions? Sorry, someone's going to jump in? Yeah, down the front. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, so my question, I mean, we've been you might have noticed that in Melbourne we've been through COVID lockdowns, and it's had a significant impact on kids, school age, all ages. So my question is more around the impact of social media slash screen time. And I find with my son that he's socialising more and more on text and group text and that non-verbal communication style, which is not what you're describing here as social fitness. I'd like you to just, if you could, or question to the panel, what are the most effective ways to wean our kids off the screen time texting, if that's possible, and other ways of socialising them or getting them to learn how to socialise better?
Oh, you're talking about that. I do think that if I had the complete answer, I might not be here today.
You wouldn't be here?
I wouldn't be here today.
Is that what you're trying to say, Matt?
I'd have a very different app right now. I'd be talking with some tech people. But I mean, in some ways, I feel like the question you have, in many ways, is like the question of our time. It's like the question of the moment, right? And I think that I always try to, as a parent, you get challenged by things that aren't, like for me, I was challenged by things that weren't the way I did it as a kid. And for my son, video games was that. Like he played a lot of video games and I kept thinking, gosh, don't play so many video games, you gotta get outside. And then I also had a moment where like, wait a minute, these video games are pretty cool. And if I had this video game when I was 14 and it was this good, I didn't have to leave my basement, I could talk to my friends all the time, why would I have done anything different, right? So then I started thinking, and my son is not disrespectful, and he's not, like, he talks to his friends in a very appropriate way. So I thought, what is my real issue? My real issue is I want him to go outside, right? That was my real issue. And so I kind of said, like, it's not that you can't play video games, but you also have to go outside. And so it became not taking away that, it became this other kind of need around that. You know, and I've actually done a fair amount of research in the past few months about this question you're asking about how do we get people off their phones, right? And there are lots of, there's apps that will track your time. There's apps that will turn off your phone after 2 hours if you said that's your limit. They're not very successful, just so you know. There's different kind of strategies you can kind of do. What I've come to figure out is that, the reason why people are on their phones often is because, it's kind of what they have in front of them right now. Like, they have other needs that aren't being met, and so the phone kind of meets those kinds of needs, right? And, I think for adolescents, though, like that's as an adult, that's what I think our issue is. For adolescents, I think it's also very different because they've grown up with this in a way that none of us have. None of us grew up with phones like this in which you could have immediate gratification. And I'd look at it this way. She is like, my daughter is like, will stay all day on her phone watching multiple channels and texting multiple people. And I think, how can your brain handle all that? But I also think like you are having communication with your friends. I think the benefit for me is that you might find your adolescent, your boy, is home more than they used to be. And that has some good things around it. But I also think it's just also having a conversation about, help me understand kind of the kind of communication you have on your phone. Is your child an outlier, right? Like is there, are they excessively on that compared to their friends who are doing other kinds of things? I would want to know that, like that might raise a concern. And then again, I just might voice a little bit like, this is part of my concern around that. I want to make sure we have moments when we turn off the phone around that. I think the thing around that is really, really, really hard is, phones do change the brain, right? And there's never been a moment like in which the dopamine hit from getting a like on your post. Like it's immediate gratification or it's immediate sadness, right? Like the way your emotions yo-yo based on social media is amazing, right? So I think we do need to be mindful of it, have a conversation about, again, what is the expectation around it. begin to set up kind of phone-free moments, right? And I would say again, and they apply to you too. Like, I don't want to give up my phone either, you know. But again, I can figure out how to do that, and then kind of see if that changes things. Like, that's just part of that suggestion around it. It's such a good question. I really do think it's the question of the time.
And it's certainly something that we're wrestling with, you know, as a school and in lots of the programs, Chris, and, you know, it's come up a number of times, particularly around the way in which our phones, you know, really, they draw us in, they keep us on. There's research to suggest that even for kids studying, having a phone in their room is a distraction. It doesn't even have to be on, just even having it there, you know, so I think we're starting to see a bit of a shift at school. I can remember a few years ago on outdoor ed programs where you'd ask kids to hand their phones and there was a bit of reluctance and reticence, but we're starting to see more acceptance of that, and I think we're starting to walk it back. And that, the only other advice I would add around that is it's a grind. You know, it is a grind, and it's something that I think as parents and guardians that we just need to show up for that conversation to you know, to keep that line somewhere, because you know, phones are really here to stay and they're really taking a lot of our concentration and time. And speaking of time, that is all of our time for this evening. Would you join with me, please, in thanking our panel and Matt. Also very grateful to Chandra and Chamath upstairs and others that have helped us put this event together. If you have any questions, we'll be around for a little while if you'd like to direct those to us. But again, thank you for your time and coming out this evening, and good night.